what we're trying to do very much within AstraZeneca is not only have a forward-facing role where we communicate directly with clinicians as to what we're planning to do with the future of AstraZeneca medications, but we're also trying to bring clinicians closer into the pharmaceutical industry so that the voice of patients is really heard when we go to developing drugs. And that's really what my role is. I'm also privileged to be the global study lead for a big study called the Novelty Study, which I'll allude to a little bit further on during the course of my presentation. Now, when I joined AstraZeneca, I joined the dark side, the evil side, the pharma tycoons who are trying to sell drugs to innocent countries, and also maybe that sort of feeling that somebody is sitting in the back of their car dealing out that little blue pill to clinicians for N=1 trials on a golfing weekend away with your wife. Those times have changed dramatically. We really have moved away from what pharma means to most clinicians, which is this disparity of clinical and patient representation versus the commercial needs of a company like AstraZeneca. We are trying very much more now to really revamp the way in which we communicate with people, as I said, to really make sure that the experiences that people are getting are much more positive than they have been in the past, and we're not just this sort of dealy drug dealer in the corner of this particular picture. We have two major other international hubs around the world, but based in Gothenburg in the US and Gothenburg in Sweden. And we could quite easily move our entire headquarters and our base of operations to one of those two sites if we needed to. And yet we're continuing to invest in the UK, and we're about to open up our major international hub and a centre of our headquarters in Cambridge. So we really believe in the UK. Now, the problem is that we have for some time relied very much on our clinical relationships with UK physicians in guiding us in the way in which we move. But we are a global organisation, and we are having to move much more outside of the UK to get a much more global perspective as to the direction our medications head in. And so many of the studies that are being developed now within AstraZeneca are targeted towards specific markets. I'll have to be honest with you, the United States accounts for around about 50% of pharmaceutical spending around the world every year. We are always going to do studies within the United States because it is such a huge component of overall healthcare spending within pharmaceutical industry. And as Raj alluded to earlier, China is becoming increasingly important as well. So many of the studies and their design, when you look at the protocol for the first time, you'll think, why on earth have they done that in an international study? And almost certainly, if it doesn't make sense within the UK context, it's because the study has been focused to some extent on the United States and in China. And there isn't any way around that. It does mean that the UK has to be extra competitive when it's competing to be a participant within global studies. Whilst we can rely on the relationships that we have with clinicians within the UK, and we certainly know that the UK provides very, very high quality research, you can't 100% rely on studies coming to the UK unless you are competitive as well. Now, we're very, very lucky here in Bradford and in Yorkshire that we're not too far away from some of the major UK hubs within the UK, particularly the major manufacturing facilities that we have in Macclesfield just down the road. And we're very focused on this area of the country to invest heavily in if we possibly can. And so finding research facilities that will help aid us with that is incredibly important for AstraZeneca. I'm going to run through 4 recent clinical trials that AZ was involved in and just give you a little bit of a perspective of how the UK did in those studies and the kinds of problems that we see. So this first study that I've put up here is an assessment of a combination inhaler therapy in patients with mild to moderate asthma. And in this study, patients could come into the study either being on a short-acting bronchodilator only and poorly controlled, or on an inhaled corticosteroid at a low dose and still being poorly controlled. Now, in this study, there were 4,500 patients recruited worldwide. In fact, it was one of 2 studies with over 8,500 patients recruited worldwide. And it was a primary care study. There were 10 sites that were set up within the United Kingdom. Most of them were in the south of the UK, and they were primary care sites. They were slow to set up. They were very, very slow to get ethical approval. They were very, very slow to actually start identifying patients to come into the study. And so out of 4,500 patients, we were successful in getting 3 patients in from the UK. Okay? And this is one of the challenges is primary care. Primary care does not have the same research network set up as some organisations such as Bradford or the NIH are within secondary care. So this is a learning point for us. Now, there were reasons why this study didn't work as well. It wasn't just because of the slow setup. It was because the British Thoracic Society guidelines in asthma are significantly different from international guidelines such as GINA. And as a result of that, there was a lot more inhaled corticosteroid use. And so it was difficult to find SABA-only patients with mild asthma because the BTS had been successful in actually changing clinical practice. And that's one thing that, again, that you need to be very much aware of, is that sometimes the UK is slightly ahead of the game clinically, which makes it difficult for these studies that are designed 2 or 3 years in advance to actually catch up and follow UK practice. So this is one circumstance where the BTS actually went slightly against us in being able to recruit patients. The second study is looking at severe asthma using a biologic agent. And this biologic agent was at that time going to be around about the 4th to market. There was already established practice within the United Kingdom around some biologics. And as a result of that, it was a competitive marketplace for the patients. And therefore it was difficult to recruit. So even though there were 23 sites within the UK that were involved in this study, each site only on average recruited around about 1 patient. Now, Astra Zeneca realised that this was going to be a slow study. What we had to do in the end was to move out to Eastern Europe to be able to recruit from sites in Eastern Europe. We met our target, but we came across the problem that Raj alluded to earlier, was that care is not as good in Eastern Europe, or at least it wasn't at that stage as it would be in the UK. So we had a huge placebo response within this study, which actually to some extent made the outcomes of the study a little diluted. Now, as a result of that, we've learnt it's important to be doing this sort of research in high quality places where the outcomes can be delivered appropriately. But nonetheless, it was again an example where we went looking elsewhere because the UK could not deliver in the way that it had hoped. Some of you will have participated maybe in the DAPR-HF study. This is a study that is recently completed and is due to be reported, and this is the methodological paper. And the DAPR-HF study was an interesting study looking at an SGL2 inhibitor across the board in heart failure after it had been demonstrated to have some effect in heart failure in patients with diabetes. And this is one of those circumstances in which we've developed a drug for one reason, and we've almost found by coincidence that it seems to be effective in another indication. So although this was an established drug, this was almost a first trial within this area. And despite the first author on this methodological paper being a UK-based physician, again, the UK was incredibly slow to start up with this particular study and difficult to recruit to. Now, because this was first to market within this particular class of drugs, this study recruited incredibly quickly, way ahead of actually AZ's expectations, and therefore UK just ran out of time. Okay? When you've got other countries that are recruiting really, really quickly and you haven't quite got your act together, then in that circumstance, you just miss out because it's competitive recruitment. Finally, the study that I'm mainly involved with is an observational study, and these sorts of studies are actually really important to the clinical community and also to pharma, to really establishing current practice but also current definitions of disease and trends in disease. So the novelty study is a study looking at asthma and COPD in a non-interventional way over 3 years. And what this is primarily, well, initially thought to be primarily a primary care study, although the more severe end of the spectrum has been secondary care. The UK was successful in recruiting 850 patients to this study, a real feather in the cap to the UK. However, 532 of those patients came from single sites within York. There was one nurse there who just decided she was going to make it her aim to get every single asthma and COPD patient in the 3 or 4 practices that she was working in into this particular trial. Now that's great for the UK and great for the study, but we are reliant now on one person driving that study in that particular area of the UK. If she goes off sick, if she has problems, then we're in real trouble with regards to those sites. So having a big team around you that can pick up the slack and if necessary, continue recruiting and continue attracting people into a study is hugely important because, as I said, the whole of York could fall over if this one nurse goes off sick. So it's really important that you think about that when you're thinking about your feasibility, is do you have a team that is equally dedicated as you are to trying to make sure that the study is a success. Now, pharma is one of those things we're a bit fickle and we're going to work on slightly shorter time frames than perhaps the NHS does. And when you propose studies to us or when there are studies going on, it's all about timing. There may be the most fantastic drug coming through in phase 1 and phase 2, but we're only selecting a small number of sites to demonstrate the efficacy of that drug. Phase 3, things explode and we suddenly get a whole lot more interest and we're happy to take a little bit more risk because we know that the drug is likely to be successful in the indication. Phase 4, which many of you don't think about so much, is actually really important. The drug has been marketed. We're not only interested in safety after that point in time, but we're also interested in moving outside the current licensed indications and looking at new ways, maybe in rarer diseases, where people can contribute to providing data that may change clinical practice. And even relatively small numbers of patients in a rare disease can be enough to get an extension to a license to get that treatment actually available. So we're looking at collaborating with you on all sorts of things, not just industry-sponsored studies, but small study ideas that you guys have that may change, as I said, clinical practice and make the drug more accessible to more patients. And those sorts of studies are like gold dust to the pharmaceutical industry, and they sometimes come out of completely left field. So if you are interested in your own ideas based on some of the research that you've already seen, you've got a big group of patients, you don't know what to do with them, you think that would be really good to trial, then the pharmaceutical industry will sponsor them. And that will be reviewed and it will be considered in the same way as if you were submitting a grant proposal to the NIHR. But if it's in the right alignment and industry is interested and all the stars are aligning up above, then there's a very, very good chance that you'll get those sorts of studies funded. Finally, I just want to talk a little bit about joint working, because joint working is something that's relatively unique to the UK. This is where you've already got established guidelines and an established therapy, and you're trying to implement it into a patient pathway and show the benefits to the NHS of optimizing a patient pathway. Pharma is really interested in these studies because of NICE. Okay? If we can demonstrate cost effectiveness and improve clinical outcomes from integrating a therapy within an established guideline in an area like Bradford, then again there will be funding that will be considered for this. And we've recently sponsored a study looking at this type of approach in Birmingham, where we introduced a diagnostic respiratory hub, one on the back of a van that goes around from site to site in primary care, providing specialist services closer to patients' homes. So those sorts of things will be considered again for funding by pharma. So don't just think about the NIHR when you're looking for particular grants or the normal sort of patient research for patient benefit approach. If you've got an idea that you think will float with pharma, then talk to your local representatives and we'll all consider them. And all companies are looking for these sorts of approaches. Thank you very much. Any particular questions?